When Mark stepped into the shelter that morning, he expected the usual chorus of barking. Instead, silence greeted him, until he saw a tiny, motionless German Shepherd puppy in the corner of a cage. Everyone thought it was too late, but what happened next stunned the world. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The winter morning air bit at Mark's face as he stepped out of his truck, the crunch of gravel under his boots echoing in the stillness. Normally, the shelter's entrance greeted him with a noisy symphony, excited barks, impatient whines, and the frantic rustle of paws against metal gates. But today there was nothing. He paused, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and frowned. The silence felt wrong, heavy, almost suffocating. As he pushed open the glass door, the familiar smell of disinfectant and dog shampoo met him, but it did little to ease the unease in his chest. Inside, the front desk volunteer offered a distracted nod, her eyes downcast, her hands clutching a clipboard a little too tightly. Mark's gaze drifted past her to the rows of kennels beyond. Even here, the usual chaos of tails wagging and voices clamoring for attention was muted. Mark had worked with animals for years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something was off. His steps slowed as he entered the kennel aisle, scanning each cage. And then, at the far end, he saw it. A small, still shape, lying in the corner. Something in his gut twisted. This wasn't going to be an ordinary visit. Mark's boots echoed softly against the concrete floor as he approached the last kennel. The faint hum of the overhead lights buzzed above, but his focus locked on the tiny, motionless body inside. A young German Shepherd puppy lay on its side, its fur dull and slightly matted, as if the life had been drained from it. His heart sank. Mark had seen neglected animals before, but something about this one struck deeper. Maybe it was the way the pup's small paw was stretched out toward the bars, frozen in place, as if it had been reaching for someone. He crouched down, his knees creaking from the movement, and rested a hand on the cold metal gate. The puppy didn't stir. A shallow breath escaped Mark's lips as he scanned for any signs of life. An ear twitch, a chest rise, anything. Then, just as he was about to stand, he saw it. The faintest flutter in the pup's ribs. Barely there, but enough to stop him in his tracks. This dog wasn't gone, not yet. Mark's pulse quickened. He knew that in moments like this, seconds could mean the difference between life and death. He had to act, and he had to act now. Mark's instincts kicked in. He fumbled for the latch, his fingers trembling against the cold metal. The gate squealed open, and in seconds, he was kneeling beside the puppy. Up close, he could see just how fragile the little one was, its tiny chest heaving in uneven, shallow breaths, each one a fight. "Hang in there, buddy," Mark whispered, sliding his hands under the pup's frail body. Its fur was icy to the touch, sending a shiver up his arms. He could feel the rapid, weak thump of its heart against his palm. The shelter staff hadn't noticed yet, so Mark called out sharply, "I need help. Now." His voice cracked with urgency, drawing startled glances from across the room. A volunteer dropped what she was doing and rushed over, her eyes widening at the sight. They moved quickly, wrapping the puppy in a thin fleece blanket and checking for a pulse again. The staff member muttered something about hypothermia and dehydration, but Mark barely heard. All he could focus on was the faint flicker of life in the puppy's half-closed eyes. He refused to let this one slip away, not when he'd found it in time, not when there was still hope. The volunteer cradled the bundled puppy as Mark hurried beside her toward the small medical room at the back of the shelter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the stainless steel table they set the puppy on. The staff vet, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, wasted no time. She clipped a thermometer under the pup's leg, frowning at the dangerously low reading. "We're losing heat fast," she said, reaching for a heating pad and gently tucking it beneath the puppy's tiny frame. Mark stood by, every muscle tense, as they draped a second blanket over the pup and began rubbing its sides in slow, rhythmic motions. The shelter's quiet hum was replaced by the rapid beeping of a portable heart monitor, each irregular blip reminding him just how close they were to losing this fragile life. "Stay with us, you've got this," he murmured, his voice thick. With emotion, the puppy's eyelids fluttered, a faint sigh escaping its mouth, and for a moment, Mark thought he saw the tiniest twitch of its tail. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite a spark of hope, and Mark knew he wasn't walking away now. Mark lingered near the medical table, his eyes fixed on the fragile life bundled in blankets. The vet, after checking the puppy's heartbeat, once more glanced at the volunteer. "Do we know how this little one ended up here?" she asked. The volunteer hesitated, biting her lip. "There's something you should see." She disappeared for a moment and returned with a thin manila folder, the kind that looked too light to carry anything good. Mark took it with trembling hands. Inside were intake notes, brief, cold sentences that somehow weighed a ton. The puppy had been found in the back alley behind the shelter, unresponsive, with signs of blunt force trauma. No microchip, no collar. No one came forward. Mark's jaw tightened as he read the last scribbled line, possible neglect. No known owner. The words made his stomach churn. He glanced at the pup again, its tiny chest rising and falling under the soft blanket. The thought that someone could abandon it to die in the shadows ignited a slow, steady burn inside him. "Whoever left you like that," Mark whispered under his breath, "doesn't get the final chapter in your story." The puppy shifted, slightly, and for the first time, its eyes fluttered open. Mark didn't leave the shelter that day. Hours slipped by as he sat beside the recovery crate, his hand resting gently against the wire, letting the puppy know it wasn't alone. Each faint whimper felt like a call he couldn't ignore. The vet had been clear. The pup's survival was uncertain, but with round-the-clock care, there was a fighting chance. The shelter staff exchanged glances when Mark asked if he could stay, their surprise giving way to quiet approval. "You know this isn't going to be easy," the vet warned. "He'll need medication, constant feeding, and someone who won't give up." Mark met her eyes, his voice steady. "I've seen harder battles. I'm not walking away from this one." The volunteer returned with adoption papers, hesitating before handing them over. "Are you sure? You just met him." Mark didn't need to think twice. He took the pen, signing his name with a resolve that felt like steel. No one else is going to leave him behind again. As he slipped his hand inside the crate, the puppy's small paw rested on his fingers. It was weak, trembling, but it was a connection. Mark knew, without a doubt, he was taking him home. Mark's living room became a makeshift recovery ward. Soft blankets were spread across the couch. A small heater kept the air warm, and a tray of medicine, feeding syringes, and bandages sat neatly on the coffee table. The puppy, now named Shadow for the way he followed Mark's every move, was still frail, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Mark set alarms for every few hours, waking in the middle of the night to check Shadow's breathing and offer tiny meals. Each time, Shadow would weakly wag his tail, as if saying thank you. Days turned into weeks. With every sunrise, Shadow grew stronger, taking his first wobbly steps, eating more, even attempting playful barks that came out as raspy squeaks. Mark couldn't help but smile every time. One evening, as Mark sat on the floor, Shadow clambered onto his lap without help. Resting his head against Mark's chest, he let out a content sigh. Mark stroked the pup's back, feeling the steady heartbeat against his palm. In that moment, it hit him. Shadow wasn't just surviving. He was living again. And for Mark, that was the real victory. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Mark decided to take Shadow for his first proper walk outside. The leash felt almost unnecessary. Shadow stuck close, glancing up at Mark every few steps, as if making sure he was still there. The air smelled of fresh rain, and the streets shimmered under the pale sunlight. They strolled past the park, where children laughed and dogs chased frisbees. Shadow's ears perked, his tail wagging faster with each new sound and scent. But then, something shifted. Across the park, a woman stopped mid-step, her eyes locked on Shadow. She froze, her face paling. Mark noticed her trembling hands before. She called out a single name, Max. Shadow stopped. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he pulled free from Mark's gentle hold and sprinted across the grass. The woman dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks as the dog leapt into her arms, showering her face with frantic licks. Mark stood there in stunned silence, realization dawning. This wasn't just a random reunion. This was the moment Shadow had been waiting for all along. Mark approached slowly, his heart pounding as he watched the reunion unfold. The woman's sobs shook her shoulders, her hands buried deep in Shadow's thick fur. When she finally looked up, her voice cracked. He's my dog. I thought he was dead." She explained through trembling breaths that her name was Claire. Shadow, whose real name was Max, had been her companion for years. One night, a fire had ripped through her home. Amid the chaos, Max had vanished. Neighbors told her no dog could have survived. She mourned him, believing he was gone forever. But Max had survived, scared, injured, and wandering. Someone must have found him and left him at the shelter, where he had been too weak and withdrawn to be noticed. Until Mark came along. Mark felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Shadow, Max, wasn't just a rescue. He had a life before, a family, a history of love. Claire wiped her tears, her eyes pleading. "I can't believe he's here. I want to take him home." Mark glanced at Max, whose tail thumped with joy. In that instant, Mark knew what the right choice had to be. Mark's chest tightened as he looked between Claire and Max. The dog's tail wagged furiously, his entire body pressed against her legs as though afraid she might disappear again. Mark crouched down, gently placing a hand on Max's head. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Looks like you found your way home." Claire's eyes glistened. "I can't thank you enough. You saved him." Mark swallowed hard, forcing a smile even as a lump formed in his throat. He had imagined bringing Shadow home, watching him heal, and building a life together. But this was different. This was Max's real homecoming. The shelter staff brought out the adoption reversal papers. Mark's pen hovered for a moment before he signed. Every stroke felt heavier than the last. When the final form was done, Claire knelt and hugged Max. Again, the dog licked her face, tail wagging in rapid bursts of pure joy. As they walked toward the door, Max turned his head back. For a brief second, his eyes locked with Mark's, soft, grateful, almost as if saying, "Thank you for bringing me back." Mark stood there, smiling through the ache, knowing he had done the right thing.